Surely the one that we're honoring her for today is that from July to December of 1945, the State Department assigned her to work in the office of the U.S. Chief of Counsel for the Prosecution of Axis Criminality at Nuremberg. In short, she became the right hand, or the left hand, depending on which side you look at, of Robert Jackson, as he took leave from the U.S. Supreme Court to become the chief U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg. She was, as John Barrett, our colleague who was felled by Irene and is unfortunately not here tonight, said in a lecture that he gave here 2 years ago, he pointed out that this picture is emblematic of the significance of Fite at the founding period of the Nuremberg trial. She's the only skirt in the picture. This was the very first landing of any of the Allied team that would work at Nuremberg after the war was over. And she was on that flight and visited Nuremberg. During that period, and this is why I say she worked at Nuremberg, but that was not all. And she did say, I will say in her letters, that it was the most interesting weekend of her life. But that same visit, she also attended the Potsdam Conference. She later, in her travels with Jackson, went to Berlin. They went to Hitler's office in Berlin and went through the rubble. And she ended up taking souvenirs with her. She reports in a letter that this is called the Cross of the Mother of, this is the Cross of Honor of the German Mother. I can only imagine how one says that in German. And it has been donated to the Truman Library, which has her papers, very voluminous, on file. And she says in a letter that Justice Jackson found it in a drawer and presented it to her, and that there is a picture somewhere of him going through this mock honoring of her with this German cross. Some archivist has got to find that picture. It would be quite interesting. She visited with Herr Schlauderpacht along with Jackson. She was at the meeting that you described earlier today. She went with Jackson to Dachau, and she writes a letter about what she saw in Dachau and how he reacted to Dachau as well. She spent 6 months as what's called an assimilated civilian. She had the rank of major, but when her parents wrote her sort of jokingly as Major Fite, she wrote a letter back immediately saying, don't do that, that's really not cool. All right, the military does not like it. We do this for purposes of rank and classification, but I am not a soldier. She did, however, have ration privileges, and what I know from these particular souvenirs that she gave the Truman Library is cigarettes seem to be very important in her life. Those big blue X's are, she got every cigarette she was permitted. Now, that may also be because they were currency in that period. That's what you traded is more important than other things. She writes in her letters about the bombings, about the stench, about the corpses that were unburied that she saw there. She refers to places like Potsdam as a, quote, charnel house, and she's very affected by this. She was, at the time that she was at Nuremberg, 40 years old and single, educated, upper-crust woman. Her father was a very, very well-known, politically connected political science professor at Vassar. And clearly, his influence was important to her because, among other things, she writes and she says, what does Dad think about the Nuremberg Charter? His opinion made a lot of importance to her. Her position made her uncomfortable. Her letters suggest she was lonely. Every time she meets a woman, she mentions it in the letters. And she also says there are very few women like me. There were a lot of stenographers who I guess today we would call ditzy, but that wasn't who she was. And so when she gets stuck going to parties like this one, a Christmas party, she's over in the corner on the right, sort of hiding behind the tree. And the relations between the men and the women are, shall we say, uncomfortable, as this picture of her really shows. You know, here's this general sort of dolling up with this other woman, and she looks like she would like to be anywhere in the world except on that couch at that time. She mentions women like Aline Chalupour who was a French woman who ends up being a prosecutor in some of the British trials at Nuremberg, and another woman, Eleanor Bontecu, who actually went to the Pacific and worked on the trials in the Pacific Theater. She saw those women fleetingly and was by and large a woman in a man's world. There were many other women Nuremberg lawyers, but they post-dated her. She left by then, so she never met Sadie Arbuthnot, Mary Kaufman, Belle Mayer, Dorothy Minskoff, or Cecilia Getz, who is the woman whom I've written about, who was the only woman to deliver an opening argument at the Nuremberg trials. Nor did she meet any of the lawyers on the other side. Erna Crowen, Agnes Nath-Schreiber, who is shown here with her client, whom she represented in a contempt proceeding, a German woman who refused to testify at the Nuremberg trials, or Elizabeth Goldwell, who was the only woman to be a lead defense counsel in the Nuremberg trials. And many of you will recognize that the man in the picture over her head is Telford Taylor, who led the second round of the Nuremberg trials. Not only that, there are huge questions about the way she was treated. This is her pass to the Potsdam Conference, Katherine Fite, secretary. In fact, the documents show she had her own secretary. There are notations back like they had in the old days. Her letters were KDF and caps / small letters. She had her own secretary, but no doubt had to fight for that status at all times. Where she was most comfortable, it seems, was at Jackson's side. She was his lawyer, but I must say she was not necessarily a prosecutor. In fact, she was a Yalta. She was a political lawyer. And so the fact that she was a political lawyer suggests a few things. Let me tell you a little bit about ways that she was. She would report back on what Molotov said about the embassy proceedings, etc. She did not keep to herself. At one point she said of a JAG lawyer that she had to talk with, "We went over a bit of business, and I felt as though I were in very high quarters, but I spoke up nonetheless." She helped interrogate von Ribbentrop, Keitel, Frick, and Goering. She criticized Justice Jackson and his conduct, not so much of the trials, but of the politics of the trials, in her letters. She said, "The justice has made a mistake. He said to the press only the U.S. means business. That was unnecessary and has made it difficult to work with our allies. The indictment was rushed," she said. "I keep telling people that there's an historical error in the indictment and no one is listening to me." When a senator comes, they apparently rush the trial date because Senator Pepper is there and he wants to get back to the States. And she writes, "So I suppose when you have senators here, you have to hurry the trial." She leaves in December. It's not entirely clear why. She had indicated she wanted to stay. I don't know if there was a falling out or what, but she decides to go home at Christmas time and never come back. And she writes from Paris where she says there's no food, there's no sidewalk cafes, goods are lousy and frightfully high. And her last letter, her last paragraph before she arrives home in her letter to her parents is this: "Europe is a sad, worn-out continent. I'm glad to leave. The U.S. is sitting atop the world. We have to run the world, but the vast majority have no idea what the rest of the world is like. And how can equilibrium be maintained between wealth and energy on the one hand, and poverty and exhaustion on the other?" Questions that yet have to be answered.